Hey, my name is Rowan Smith and I want to welcome you to the Training for Trekking podcast. Now, this is the world's very first podcast which is entirely dedicated to helping you train, prepare and conquer your upcoming hike, trek or mountain adventure. So once a week, I'm going to be giving you quality and practical information on the subjects of physical preparation for trekking, dealing with altitude and nutrition on the trail, so you can know everything you need to be doing to have the best chance of a safe, enjoyable and successful adventure. So now you know what you're in for, let's get into today's episode. Alright, hello guys. Today I want to talk about the big rocks of training for hiking. And specifically we're going to go into what the priorities are for hikers in their training and what are the things you really should be focusing on and honing in on to the best of your abilities before focusing on other things that may not be so important or may potentially get in the way of your success. Now, this episode was inspired by an actual podcast I was listening to the other day, which a guy was talking about a really interesting analogy, a really interesting theory about prioritization. And basically this thing is called the big rock theory. And it's all about sort of figuring out what your priorities are and sort of where you should be focusing on. And the theory is pretty simple. Now, essentially, you just want to imagine you've got quite a big jar. You got a number of bigger rocks, you got some pebbles, and you got some sand. Now, if you fill this jar with sand first, then pebbles, then big rocks, everything isn't going to fit in the jar. It's just not going to happen, and those big rocks are not going to get in there. However, if you fill the jar with the rocks first, then the pebbles, and then the sand, everything will generally fit in there nice and smoothly. And the idea behind this theory, it's a really, really easy way of envisioning sort of where you need to focus on your priorities and trying to emphasize the point that there's certain big rocks that you should be focusing on first, whether it's in your life, in your business, in your social life, or in our case, in your training. And it's essential that you focus on them first. Because if you focus on the smaller things, so the sand or the petals first, and ignore these big rocks until it's too late, then you simply won't be able to fit them in. And I thought this was a really cool analogy and it fits into our training theory really, really well. Because when it comes to training for hiking, it really does come down to priorities. Some people get way too swept up in the smaller details, like the sand in this example, and just don't put enough emphasis into their big rocks. And it really, really does tell. So when it comes to training, following this analogy, this is kind of what things look like. Now, for your big rocks, so the foundational pieces of your training and the things that you need to focus on first and put the most emphasis into, comes down to your hiking, which is obvious, your low intensity cardio, so walking, loaded pack walking, swimming, cycling, anything that's lower intensity for long duration, and your strength training. They are your three big rocks of training for hiking and they need to be prioritized first. Now, your pebbles, that typically comes down to things like hiking specific conditioning. So it's like your stair sessions, your hill sessions, your hiking specific interval sessions, and things like that. It's about the next one's mobility and the next one's recovery. You know, these three things are all important, but they're not very valuable unless you've nailed those big rocks first. And they're definitely not worth focusing on unless you've got those big rocks in place. And then finally, the sand. So the little things that can be beneficial, but they're not worth doing first, and they're not your priorities, are things like high intensity interval training, breathing training, exercise classes, fasted training, and things like that. You know, these things that get very, very popularized online, and you read books about them, you see them online, you see a lot of people talking about them because they are exciting, they're fun, whatever it may be, but they're not the big rocks. And if you're focusing on these types of things, and not focusing on the big rocks first, it's not a really great way of going about things. So really on the intention of this episode today was just hammer home the point that I have talked about a lot. When it comes to training for hiking, there are certain things that have priority. They might not be super exciting, they might not be super new, they might not be fun to tell people about, but they are the ones that are going to pay off most for your training. Get your hiking, your low intensity cardio, and your strength training in first. Once you've done that, think about things about your hiking specific conditioning, your mobility, your recovery, and all of that. And then once that's all sorted, then you can start thinking about all those little grains of sand and see how they fit into the picture. So hopefully that'll give you a bit of an insight, maybe a bit of a reminder, maybe a bit of a wake-up call into your training at the moment. Have a think about what you're doing. Are you focusing on those big rocks? Are you putting enough time into those big rocks? Have you been developing those big rocks? If you have, great. If you haven't, it might be time to rethink things. So thank you so much for listening today, guys. Hope you've enjoyed it. Hope it's given you a bit of an insight, and I really do hope you've gotten a bit out of this. If you did want to learn a little bit more about these types of things, any of the exercise, any of the workouts or the types of training I've mentioned today, or explore anything in a little bit more detail, come and find me in the Training for Hiking and Trekking Facebook group. Now, inside that group, I'm always happy to explore things in a little bit more detail, share extra workouts or whatever it may be. So come and find me. It's a Training for Hiking and Trekking Facebook group. I'll leave a link in the show notes below. So thank you for listening, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye.